Today we've got a crazy revenge story of getting a husband to cut contact with their own daughter. We'll get into that in a bit, but first, I reported my drug addict husband to the Marine authorities. I've known my ex-husband since I was very little. We were neighbors before we moved many blocks away from where my family lived. When his mother died, his dad was too heartbroken to do anything for him, and his grandparents had to buy a house a few blocks away to be closer to him. His dad eventually got over his mom's death, met someone, and they got married. He also had to move because his new wife lived in a different state and she had a great job there. He asked if my ex wanted to come along, but he refused. He didn't believe that his father wanted him to go, so he chose instead to move in with his grandparents. We were 16 at the time and were already deeply engrossed in our relationship. His grandparents, father, and stepmother loved me, but my parents were skeptical. I remember my mom telling me not to get too attached to him just in case we broke up, but we ended up getting married anyway. My ex was handsome. I'd give him that. He was drop-dead gorgeous. He had the most beautiful eyes, beard, hair, and jawline. He was simply beautiful to look at. And I spent all the time we were together protecting him from the prying eyes of women who wanted to have him and envied me for having someone like that in my life. On the outside, our relationship seemed like the best love story ever. But anyone who took a closer look at us knew that I certainly wasn't happy in that relationship. He was probably not happy either. My ex cheated on me all the time. And you know what's worse? He would tell me each time he did it and make up one excuse about him being heartbroken over his mom's death too. One time when we were fresh out of high school, he went out with some of his friends, met some college girls, and started sleeping with one of them. She fell in love with him and they started a whole relationship, all while I was still with him, and he made sure to let me know. Each time I got mad and ended our relationship, he'd come to my house, get on his knees, and cry. My mom didn't know what was going on with us. I never told her because I knew that she'd immediately ask me to leave. He was my first love, so leaving wasn't an option for me at the time. I needed to prove anyone wrong. I also wanted the life he promised me. I wanted to have a handsome husband, have a small life, write children's books, and take care of our 2 kids whenever he was away. I wanted to prove to our old friends from high school that he chose me at the end of the day. Some girls had said things about me not being worthy of someone that handsome, since I wasn't a pretty magazine cover girl. Anyway, after high school, my ex was very confused about what he wanted to do, so he spent 2 years trying to figure that out. At the time, I was already in college studying to get my degree. I was never bothered about him not going to college. I simply didn't care. My brother, who was 12 years older than me, never went to college, yet at the time he was doing very well financially, well enough to help me cover half of my college tuition. So of course, it never bothered me that my ex wasn't considering college. My ex, however, was just not convinced that I wouldn't leave him just because I'd gotten a college degree. He kept talking about it so much that it started to cause problems in our relationship. He started to do drugs. I would call him and half the time he was high on something, and then he would blame me for it. Say he was doing all those drugs because he was constantly worried about losing me and all that. I figured questioning him about his frequent drug use was putting more pressure on our relationship, so I stopped asking. After my sophomore year, I returned home to find that my ex had a drug problem. It was so serious that his dad completely cut him off and told him that he would never amount to anything in his life. His stepmom also invited me and his older sister to speak with him about seeking help. We staged the intervention and luckily it went well. My ex agreed to be taken to rehab and that was it. He came out 5 months later, happier and sober. One day, he told me that he was enlisting in the Marine Corps. I was happy for him. His grandfather was in the army and his father really respected his granddad, so he wanted his father to be proud of him. I didn't even think he could be that selfless. His decision to join and get enlisted came as a shock to everyone, and while the stepmom supported him, she confided in me that she was skeptical. Even my ex told me that he knew his mom didn't trust that he was done with drugs, and that he'd overheard her telling his sister that his recovery was just too quick. I told my stepmom that while I understood her concerns, I trusted that my man was okay and completely healed from his addiction. My ex was determined to prove his mother and sister wrong and to show his father that he could be as brave and strong as his grandfather. In fact, at a point in his life, all my ex wanted to do was prove to his dad that he could be somebody. Before he went off to boot camp, we got married. It was a small wedding, the kind of organic wedding I'd planned with lots of flowers and simplicity. My parents paid for it and it went well. After we got married, my ex went off to boot camp and I went back to college to complete my senior year. While he was in camp, my ex's insecurity about our marriage grew. He just didn't believe that I wouldn't cheat on him. Whatever I did was harshly misrepresented as me looking down on him because he did not have an education. Still, I kept trying to prove to my man that I loved him and would never think less of him because I had a degree and he didn't. You know what's so sick about all this? All the while that my ex was away, he was cheating on me with a particular woman who was also in boot camp. He was cheating with her and even telling me about it. Each time something happened, he would cry to me and tell me he's sorry. I sometimes cried with him too, but then the next month, he would tell me about how they got together again and how sorry he was. I should have divorced him at this time, but I didn't. I just kept hoping that somehow he would change. When he graduated, we both moved into my parents' old house, and that was the beginning of my nightmare. My ex would cheat on me right in that house, and he always made sure I found out. I would go out to shop for a sanitary pad and return to meet him making out with a woman in the living room. Still, I tolerated his behavior and stayed with him, even though it was clear that he wanted me to catch him. At this time, we were struggling to have a baby, and I just thought that if we had a child, my ex would finally behave himself properly. He loved children, so I didn't think he would want to do anything to jeopardize his relationship with his kids. After trying for 2 years and going through so much heartbreak every month whenever my period came, I became pregnant. I was excited, but my husband was mad when I broke the news to him. He kept telling me that he wasn't ready to be a father, and that was funny because he used to tell me about how he could not wait to be a father and how he wanted our child to keep me company while he was away on deployment. I begged and begged for him to let me keep the baby, but he refused. He made it very clear that I either had the baby alone, he swore that he would divorce me, or that I waited until he was ready and we could raise our kid together. I was naive and stupid, so I decided to get an abortion. After getting one, things became even worse for us. It was at this time that I found out that my ex had gotten the woman he was dating while he was in boot camp pregnant. That day, I felt the kind of anger that I'd never experienced in my life. It turned out that my ex was trying to leave me and he didn't want us to have a child together, and that was why he made me get an abortion. I was beyond livid, but not in a bad crap crazy way. I was angry, but I was so calm in the face of it all. I wanted to hurt my ex. I wanted to hurt him so badly for all that he'd put me through in that relationship. When I found out about his unborn child and confronted him, he began again with lies, profuse apologies, and tears. He apologized for a while, and I pretended to have forgiven him as usual. The other woman had issues in their relationship. She kept trying to get him to leave, but I guess he wanted to ease into it, and he wasn't sure if he could take that big of a step for her yet. At the time, they were preparing for their deployment and were due to leave the country in a month. One day, I went out and bought the drugs that my ex used to abuse. I kept them where he could see them, and when he asked me what was going on, I told him that I was taking them to ease myself of the stress of work and trying for another baby. I knew my ex was going to start using it in a matter of time, and I was right. Not only did he finish my drug, but he also went out to buy new ones. If you're familiar with addiction, then you should know how that works. Bringing an addict close to his object of addiction after a long time can cause him to binge on it. That was what my ex did. I then went to the Marine authorities and told them that I was worried about my husband and his drug habits. They invited him, he got tested, and his deployment was immediately suspended. All my ex wanted was to go off to some war and prove to his dad that he was a real man like my grandfather. He was very upset about what I'd done. Of course he knew, I made sure of it. Another thing about addictions is that the more stressed one is about it, the more one tends to indulge in it. My ex started to worry so much about the drug problem that he had a big relapse and just went back to drugs and life in general. His girlfriend is still a single mom of their son to this day. She got the man, but she got a broken man. At the end of the day, his father was right about him. He was never going to amount to anything in life. So I've heard some brutal stories pop up from time to time, and I've got to say this maybe not brutal, but devious, approaching evil, like one of the just most dark turns. Just the story of, yeah, I was upset with him being a serial cheater and a bad faith partner, so I got him hooked back on Dergs. That's just rough. That said, our next story is, I got rid of my abusive partner after months of abuse. I don't regret my actions. Who would have ever thought that the idea of being in a relationship, a very serious one at that, would come with a whole lot of responsibilities and expectations? Mine in particular was even more demanding and much more trouble-filled than I was expecting, so much so that I had to opt out as soon as I could. All so I could prevent things from escalating past what was within my capabilities. However, things were ultimately going to take a turn for the worse, and it didn't seem like there was anything I could do about it. Or rather, it seemed like I had no choice but to resort to the action I took. My partner and husband, male 32, and I, female 27, had been happily married for the better part of the last 5 years. And I must tell you, what people refer to as the honeymoon phase of a relationship was practically non-existent in our case, as what we had was very much special, so much so that I never could have imagined a situation, or rather life, without him. He truly became an integral part of my life some 9 years ago, back when I was still in high school. But mind you, this was not when we were officially together, neither was it when we had officially become acquainted with each other. In fact, we go as far back as middle school. And the truth of the matter is that both of our parents were acquainted from back in their college days, and I guess you could say it was inevitable for the both of us to even have been together and all. Let's take a trip down memory lane, shall we, and look back to where my partner, let's call him Cole for the sake of my story, and I came from. While I was growing up, I never really had much friends, as I was an only child from the start, and it didn't seem like my parents were even ready to have more children, and it was not something I had the mental fortitude to comprehend at the time. But summarily, I spent the better part of my childhood in solitary confinement. And I know how this might sound, but it's the only thing I can liken my situation back then to. My parents were almost never around, and when they weren't around for long, and because of this, I was always at home, all by myself. But it wasn't like this was all that bad. This was until I fell ill. And to no one's surprise, I was all alone at home to take care of myself. I realized that I really needed them and they weren't there for me. I guess they realized this too, and also the fact that they were actually terrible parents and they weren't getting any better. So from that moment onwards, I think they resolved themselves to be better. And all of a sudden, my parents had now gone from never being around to always being around. And it felt uncomfortable in some different kind of way, but there was nothing I could have said or done about that. I just needed a means of escape. And it didn't seem like that was going to be made possible at the time. Not until something really unexpected happened. So we got some newcomers in our residential estate, and coincidentally it turned out to be my parents' college acquaintances. And they apparently had a daughter and a son. Unlike my parents, the idea of having a sibling felt really nice, but then it didn't seem like something I would get to experience anytime soon. But then it didn't mean that this would stop me in the very least from making friends with the newcomers in the estate. And almost as if it were fated, the newcomers were quite receptive, and I was able to easily feel settled and at home. At the time, I was only acquainted with the daughter of the Smiley, who turned out to be my very close friend. The only person that wasn't at all receptive was her brother, who would later turn out to be my partner in the near future. Now, if I can remember correctly, this was around the time my parents were now beginning to revisit their old habits, as they were soon almost never around. I can't say I'm not disappointed, but then I guess this was because they knew I was in safer hands and all. The only difference between their initial absence and their subsequent absence was the fact that they now made it a priority to keep in touch every single day, just to make sure that I was safe and okay. And to me, that was effort enough. Anyways, I spent most of my childhood up until I was about to leave high school at the home of my parents' acquaintances. And that was how Cole and I came to grow up with each other, even though we never really had much of a conversation. Moving forward, there were times where I even felt offended by the fact that he was always ignoring my presence, and I even wanted to act out, but then it didn't really feel like it was worth it at the time. and so I've always killed off any of such ideas up until one fateful day when I was having issues with a certain bully back in school. It wasn't necessarily a bully per se, but then the complicated situation just turned out to be so for some reason, and I found myself right in the middle of it all. And the one person I didn't even expect to help me out of that situation was none other than Cole, as he was a senior at the time. And it felt like he was kind of saving me, which sparked the initial flame of interest in me. He scolded me, not seriously though, and asked me why I'd never come to meet him following the troubles I'd been having back in school. And I couldn't say anything but place my head down in shame, I guess? From that moment forward, I don't think I ever had any issues with any person, teacher, or student till I graduated. His sudden urge to protect me was suddenly something I got used to quite quickly, and this turned out to be the stepping stone for proper conversations between the both of us, as I soon found myself going to him for every single problem I had. And I think this is what eventually led to me developing some certain kinds of feelings over time. And I think the feeling was actually mutual, as around the time when we both were in college, I guess you could say that we couldn't hold back how we both truly felt about each other. And eventually, down the line, we both found ourselves in a situation where we were overwhelmed with emotions and feelings for each other. So much so that we actually had our first kiss that fateful and unforgettable night. It was certain at that very moment that we were already in a relationship with each other at the time, as although the verbal confirmation came much later on, we both knew what and how we both felt about each other. Now, from this moment till we both graduated from college with our degrees, we were practically inseparable, and I think it was even well known between and amongst our families. Now, the focal point of my story was on the precipice of beginning, as what soon became the deciding factor in the direction each of our lives was going to take would soon occur. About an entire year after graduating from college, Cole popped the big question, and although I accepted almost immediately, I still had my doubts, as to be very honest, there were some things about Cole that was still sketchy, but I chose to ignore them as I felt like they weren't my burden to carry. And I'm just now realizing that if we were going to get married to each other, it should be worthy of note that nothing should be off limits for conversation. Basically, there was always this feeling that Cole was hiding something from me. Well, not exactly hiding per se, but then it felt like he was keeping me from finding out about something very important. The only problem was, I just couldn't wrap my finger around what it was. This would eventually come to stab me in the back. Eventually, of course. We got married as planned almost 8 months after he proposed, and the wedding was supported by both our families. With a major financial burden on Cole, it seemed surprising at the time, as I couldn't figure out where exactly he got the money to afford the entirety of our wedding. But then again, I didn't want to spoil the mood and everything, and so I just dropped it. Big mistake from my end. Married life was good to both of us. We never really lacked anything, and whenever it seemed like we were lacking in some area or suspect of our lives, Cole always had a solution for everything, and his dependability was what made us last. Well, that among many other things. However, things took a really sharp turn for the worse one very day, and that was the day my entire life changed. This was about 5 years after we'd been together. Happily at that too, I might add, and I've never been happier, but I guess I wasn't the wiser to have asked the right questions when it mattered. As one very day, Cole came back home and he was beyond annoyed and irritated. I tried to question what was going on, and that was when the most shocking thing happened. He laid his hands on me. For the first time since I'd known him, this was the first time I would be seeing this side of him ever. I was confused and experiencing a flood of emotions, but none triumphed over the searing pain I was feeling from his attack. The beating didn't stop there. He still went at it for quite a while until he eventually stopped and realized what he had done. But by that time, it was already too late. The deed had already been done, and there was nothing he could have done to rectify it. The next day, he apologized with all manner of sincerity, as he couldn't believe what he had done. And then he went further to explain what he had been doing for work all these years. Apparently, he had moved some certain substances for a certain someone, and this was simply all done in a covert manner. However, that very day, there were some complications at the workplace, and he experienced quite the loss, hence his venting out on me. I try to be sympathetic and reasonably understand what was going on, but this, however, was my biggest mistake. I simply was just a fool, as the beatings were geometrically progressing over the months, and every time it happens, I always believe he would never do it again. But then he goes on to repeat the same process over and over again, until I was eventually exhausted and decided to take control of my life in some way, form, shape, or manner. And the only thing that came to mind was the so-called business he told me about, and I figured that the only way to really stop what was going on was to make sure he was no longer in my life. And I did that by getting any and everything implicating I could on him, and practically implicating him. The risk behind this was the fact that he would be very much aware of who implicated him, but then the risk was very well worth it, as I definitely needed to get myself rid of him. Enough was enough, as there was a certain limit to the kinds of abuse I could take, and I don't regret my actions, not in the slightest. And even though when he eventually gets out, he might hold a grudge, I stand by what I did. It's horrible that OP had to experience this. I mean, imagine growing up with somebody who's been almost your entire life your knight in shining armor, and then finding out after all of that, after years of your whole life with this person, finding out not only do they have an incredibly dark, monstrous side to them you don't know of, that side pops up and starts lashing out and hurting you too. That said, our next story is, I made my husband cut his daughter off. When I was a teenager, my parents moved to the city because dad was offered a job there. We got into a new school, and while my mom and siblings were finding it hard to settle in the city, and the school that was quite unlike the school we attended in the suburban area we lived in before we moved, I loved it. Do you know why? I had a boyfriend in school, a guy I was thoroughly in love with. I was completely smitten by him and he was in love with me too. We had a nice thing going on for us. He was my only friend in that school and he treated me like I was the most beautiful thing to ever exist. Sadly, we had to move back to the suburbs because my mom and siblings were having issues adjusting to life in the city. My parents were constantly fighting about it, and eventually Dad agreed to us moving back to the suburbs while he worked in the city on weekdays and returned home every weekend. It was difficult to maintain a long-distance relationship with my boyfriend. Long-distance relationships are hard enough, but for two teenagers, it was a lot harder. Eventually, distance frustrated our relationship and we ended it. Fast forward to years later, I ran into this high school boyfriend and we connected instantly. Like the old times, we talked for hours on the phone, constantly chatting and going on fun dates. He was a professor in college while I had an interior decor shop. We were having so much fun when he broke the news to me. He was in love with me, but he was separated from his wife. He had gotten a woman pregnant shortly after high school. Her parents insisted that they both get married, and they did, but as they grew, they drifted apart. At the time we met, he'd been separated from his wife for 7 months, and that was how we were able to hang out frequently. He said he was going back to his wife to see if they could make it work for the sake of their daughter. I was hurt, but I also thought it was an honorable and selfless thing to do for a child. For the second time, the love of my life slipped through my fingers. After that happened, I got married to someone else, but we got a divorce 2 years later. I completely gave up on love and decided I would just focus on my business. 8 years later, I was at a concert when I ran into this high school sweetheart. I was happy to meet him again, and he asked me out on a date, but I refused. I wasn't about to go through what I went through the last time we were together. He told me that he was now properly divorced and had been for 2 years, but I still refused. I said goodbye and left. I thought that was it until one evening when I was closing down the boutique with my assistant at the end of the day, and I saw him walk in. I watched him ask my assistant about me and watched her point at me. When he turned in my direction, our eyes met. And I just knew at that moment that he was the one for me. I knew at that moment that we were going to spend the rest of our lives together. And you know what? He told me the same thing. He felt at that moment that we were just destined to be together. Long story short, we started dating again. Our relationship was a fast-paced one. It was like reconnecting with an old friend, so we only had to catch up as opposed to getting to know each other from scratch. His daughter and I didn't meet until after our marriage because she was still living with her mother. He also told me that she was mad that he was getting married again. He told me that he didn't care if she never spoke to him again. He had let her get in the way of his happiness in the past, and he wasn't going to do that again. She refused to speak to him, and whenever he called at her mom's house, she would blatantly refuse to see him. Both mother and daughter were treating him horribly, but my husband kept trying. He hoped that his daughter would one day know that she was being manipulated by her mom. His daughter was 16 at the time and was just about to get into her senior year. I honestly believed at the time that she was old enough to see through her mother's manipulative tactics, especially since she knew her dad and he was present all her life, but I knew my husband wasn't going to give up on his child. So I supported him anyway. On different occasions, he asked if she wanted to meet me and tried to set up dinner or lunch, but she would refuse and throw a tantrum. Shortly after our wedding, my stepdaughter moved in with us. Her mother had thrown her out of her home. Her dad was very upset about this and worried that she would feel unloved, but I wasn't convinced that a mother wouldn't just throw her high schooler out of the house. I suspected that something was wrong, that she must have done something wrong. When she moved in with us, I realized why her mother wanted her gone. You see, my husband and his sister didn't grow up with their dad, so my husband wanted to be involved in his child's life. His sister had 4 kids by different men, and my husband was convinced that she always chose horrible men because they didn't have a father, and he badly wanted to do right by his daughter. The problem, though, was that he overindulged her, and she grew up to be very entitled and spoiled. My first 3 years of living with my stepdaughter were heck. She did all the petty textbook things to me, from putting gum in my hair to filling my shoes with sand. It was silly and childish for someone her age, but she did it anyway. When all that started, I refrained from reporting her to my husband. I didn't want to look weak, like I couldn't hold my own without him. I also wanted to talk to her myself, girl to girl. To be honest, I didn't think it would be a problem the first, second, and third time. I just figured she was just worried that someone else would steal her dad's attention from her. Most girls want their dads to be married to their moms anyway. As someone whose parents got a divorce when I was a teenager too, it was quite difficult for me seeing my dad move on to be with another woman. I mostly lived with my mom, but on weekends and other days when I lived with my dad and his girlfriend, I found it a bit difficult. When her behavior continued, I went to her one day and tried to talk to her, but she attacked me. I'm talking about a physical attack. She charged at me and tried to hit me. When I held her back, she disengaged and threw a flower vase at me. Thankfully, she missed, but it broke. I decided that I was going to leave the pieces of the broken flower vase for her dad to see. When he returned from his classes, I told him what had happened and then told him that evidence was downstairs for him to see. My husband hurried downstairs to take a look at the broken vase, but it wasn't there. My stepdaughter had wiped the place clean. Not even a speck of dirt was left. I knew at that moment that I had a psychopath on my hands. She wasn't just a child throwing tantrums, but she was deliberately making efforts to hurt and sabotage my relationship with her father. My husband, of course, believed me, since our flower vase was nowhere to be found, but I think seeing the broken flower vase would have proved my point further. I patiently waited for her to be done with high school, with the hopes that she would move out after, but she didn't. We lived on the university campus where my husband taught, and she went to college there. At first, she moved into the dormitory, but had to leave when she fell out with her roommate. Since that happened, she just continued to live with us. One would think that since she was an adult, she'd be more cautious and respectful, but no, she continued to do the weirdest stuff. It didn't even help that around that time, she started to drink a lot. She was already at the point of addiction and was in and out of short rehabilitation programs. Her father was frustrated, but she didn't make it easy for him to tolerate her at all. She was disrespectful towards me and would do things nearly every day to frustrate me. The complaints got so much that I stopped telling my husband about it. He would either beg me to tolerate her because she was dealing with an addiction, or he'd become very sad about her behavior. I decided to stop telling him about it and just handle it my way. One summer, she returned from yet another rehab program, but her behavior was even worse than it was before. She barged into my room one afternoon and asked me for money, which was strange because that never happened. I turned her down for good reason, and she took off her top and threw it at me. I left the room quietly. Later in the afternoon, while I was preparing dinner, she came into the kitchen and began to hurl insults at me. She said so many mean and hurtful things, but I ignored her. The more I ignored her, the more she said. She teased me about being barren. My husband and I had been trying for a child for years, but I ignored her. She then opened one of the cupboard compartments and threw the contents out. That part of the cupboard contained cooking condiments like salt, pepper, and spices, so it created a mess on the floor. She did that and walked away. I left the contents there and went up to my room. I thought about how to handle the situation for a while, and then I went back to the kitchen and continued cooking. After I was done with cooking, I picked a knife and stabbed myself in the palm. Then I went out and asked a neighbor to drive me to the hospital. That evening, my husband returned from school and was surprised to see that I wasn't home. He called, but I deliberately left my phone at home. He was eating his dinner when my neighbor went in and told him that I was in the hospital getting my hands stitched. The crazy thing was that when my husband came to the hospital, he didn't even ask what happened. He just asked, "Did she do this?" And then he got mad. He tried to call the police, but I told him not to. I told him she was already dealing with a lot, but that I could never return to that house because my life wasn't safe there. He promised to kick her out. Not only did my husband kick his daughter out of the house, he completely cut her out of his life. Nothing she said in defense made any sense to him. After she was out of our lives, for the first time since I moved in with my husband, I had peace. My relationship with my husband got so much better. He still doesn't know I lied about his daughter stabbing me. Oh, so we're gonna end it on a very psychotic note like that. I mean, hey, OP got their revenge, they got what they wanted in the end, but I don't know if it's any better than the craziness that their stepdaughter brought into their life. I mean, yikes. I can't even imagine admitting that to even an anonymous Reddit forum. But with that being said, that's all the time we have for today. Now, if you want to hear another absolutely crazy revenge story, check out that video on the left. Or if you missed my latest video, check out that video on the right. That said, I'll see you all next time with some more stories.